Imagine being stranded on a raft in the middle of the ocean with no food, water, or hope. And on top of that, you have to face storms, sharks, and cannibalism. Imagine being one of the 15 survivors out of 150 people who started on the raft. This is the story of the Raft of the Medusa, one of the most shocking and powerful paintings in history. In this video, we will explore how Théodore Géricault created this masterpiece of French Romanticism and what it reveals about the human condition and the society of his time. The Raft of the Medusa is a huge oil painting that measures 4.91 by 7.16 meters, or 16 by 23 feet. It is currently displayed at the Louvre Museum in Paris, where it attracts thousands of visitors every year. But what is the story behind this painting? Why did Géricault choose to paint such a gruesome and dramatic scene? And what makes this painting so influential and important in the history of art? Well, in order to find an answer to these questions, we need to go back to the year 1816, when France was recovering from the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars and the Bourbon Restoration. In the summer of 1816, France was on a mission to regain its former glory and territory after the defeat of Napoleon. One of its objectives was to re-establish its control over the colony of Senegal, which had been taken over by the British during the war. In order to achieve this, a fleet of 4 ships was dispatched from the port of Rochefort, with the intention of reaching the Senegalese capital of St. Louis. The flagship of this fleet was the Medusa, a naval frigate that carried more than 400 people, including soldiers, sailors, passengers, and colonists. The man who was in charge of this vessel was Hugh du Roi de Charmeraille, a loyal supporter of King Louis XVIII, who had only recently restored the Bourbon monarchy in France. Charmeraille had been given the command of the Medusa as a reward for his political allegiance, but he was not qualified for this responsibility. He had not sailed for 2 decades, and he lacked the skills and experience that were required for such a voyage. He also disregarded the advice and warnings of his more competent officers, who tried to guide him along the safest route. Instead, he followed his own course, which brought him dangerously close to the coast of West Africa. There, he made a fatal mistake. What happened was that he miscalculated his position and ran his ship aground on a sandbank on July 2nd. The Medusa could not be moved. This was the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The Medusa was stuck and could not be freed. The situation was desperate, as there were not enough lifeboats for all 400 people on board. Charmeraille decided to abandon ship and leave with his officers and some passengers of the lifeboats, leaving behind about 150 sailors and soldiers on a makeshift raft that was hastily constructed from the ship's timbers. The raft was supposed to be towed by the lifeboats, but soon it was cut loose and left to drift in the open sea. The people on the raft faced starvation, dehydration, mutiny, violence, and cannibalism. They also had to endure storms, sharks, and exposure to the sun. Out of the 150 people who started on the raft, only 15 survived after 13 days of horror. They were finally rescued by another ship, the Argus, which had been looking for them. The survivors told their story to the public, and it caused a huge scandal in France and abroad. The people were outraged by the cowardice and negligence of Charlemagne and his officers, who had saved themselves while leaving behind their men. The incident also exposed the corruption and incompetence of the Bourbon regime, which had favored aristocrats over merit in appointing officials. One of the people who was deeply moved by this tragedy was Théodore Géricault, a young painter who was looking for a subject that would launch his career and challenge his artistic skills. Géricault was fascinated by the drama and emotion of the event, and decided to paint it on a large scale, as if it were a history painting. A history painting was considered the most noble and prestigious genre of painting at the time. Why was this so? Well, because it depicted scenes from ancient or Roman history that had moral or political significance. However, history painting usually followed strict rules of composition, style, and also a decorum that was imposed by the Academy of Fine Arts, which organized the official Salon expedition in Paris. Géricault wanted to break free from these rules and create a new kind of history painting that would be a testament to his own vision and creativity. He wanted to paint a scene that was not heroic or idolized, but rather realistic and easy to relate with. He wanted to show the suffering and despair of ordinary people who had been betrayed by their leaders and abandoned by the hands of their fate. To achieve this goal, Géricault did extensive research and preparation before starting his painting. He interviewed 2 of the survivors of the raft, who gave gave him details about their ordeal. He also visited hospitals and morgues, where he studied corpses and body parts to capture their color and texture. He even brought severed limbs and heads to his studio to use as models. Needless to say, he took his job very seriously. That's not all though. He also built a scale model of the raft, which he placed in his studio under different lighting conditions to study its perspective and shadows. He made hundreds of sketches and studies of figures, poses, expressions, and gestures. He experimented with different compositions and arrangements until he found one that suited his purpose. He finally began working on his canvas in late 1818. He worked for almost a year applying thick layers of paint with a palette knife and a brush. He used dark and somber colors to create a contrast with the bright sky and the pale flesh of the bodies. He also used diagonal lines and curves to create a sense of movement and tension in the scene. The result was a stunning painting that depicts the moment when the survivors on the raft see a ship on the horizon and try to signal it with a piece of cloth. Let's now talk about the details of this artwork. This painting is divided into two parts. On the left, we see the dead and dying, who are piled up on the lower part of the raft. Their bodies are twisted and contorted, showing signs of violence and decay. Some of them have been eaten by their companions, as evidenced by the bones and skulls that are scattered on the raft. While on the other side, we see the living, who are standing or kneeling on the higher part of the raft. They are expressing different emotions such as hope, despair, anger, fear, resignation. Some of them are pointing at the ship, while others are praying or collapsing. The most prominent figure is a black man, who is holding up the cloth and waving it with all his strength. He is Jean-Charles, a former slave who had joined the French army and was one of the leaders of the mutiny on the raft. He is also one of the 15 survivors. Géricault made a deliberate and bold choice to place a black man at the center of his composition, as a symbol of courage and humanity. He also wanted to use his painting as a medium to make a strong statement against slavery and racism, which were still widespread and accepted in France and its colonies. By doing so, he challenged the established conventions and prejudices of his time, and showed his sympathy and solidarity for the oppressed and marginalized people who suffered under the colonial system. The Raft of the Medusa was exhibited at the Salon of 1819, where it caused a sensation among the critics and the public, who were divided by its subject matter and style. Some admired its realism and emotion, which captured the horror and the humanity of the event. They praised Géricault for his courage and originality in depicting such a controversial and shocking scene. Others condemned its ugliness and horror, which violated the rules and the taste of the Academy of Fine Arts. They criticized Géricault for his lack of skill and refinement in painting such a grotesque and disturbing scene. Some saw it as a political statement, which denounced the corruption and the injustice of the Bourbon regime. The painting also had an impact on other artists, who were inspired by its originality and power. Among them were Eugène Delacroix, J.M.W. Turner, Gustave Courbet, and Edouard Manet, who followed Géricault's examples and explored new themes and techniques in their own works. They adopted Géricault's use of realism and emotion, his bold choices and brushstrokes, his dramatic composition and lighting, and his choice of subjects that challenged the conventions and prejudices of their time. They also acknowledged Géricault as one of the pioneers of Romanticism, a movement that emphasized individuality, imagination, and passion in art. Click on any of the two videos on the screen right now for more content.